My stepfather entered the picture when I was 10 years old. He was an NFL football player. My grandmother actually played center field for the Rockford Peaches, the League of Their Own story. And my uncle's in the NFL Hall of Fame. So I always felt like I had to measure up somehow. I felt like there was always something to prove to somebody. And unfortunately, I became that best little boy in the world. And it really stemmed from that internal insecurity that I carried with me.
That insecurity is what Edward Krumpotich believes led him down the dangerous path of illicit drugs.
From teacher of the year to homeless, on the streets with plastic bags, and I mean for years. So I walked the streets of Minneapolis for off and on, in between treatment spells, in and out of shelters for about 6 to 7 years. I would be frostbitten, no joke, frostbite on the hands, everywhere.
I'm Kennecke, and this is Grieving Out Loud, a podcast focused on increasing awareness about our nation's drug epidemic. By doing so, we can hopefully reduce the stigma associated with substance use disorder, prevent people from experimenting with drugs, and encourage more individuals to seek treatment. Join me today as I sit down with Edward Krumpotich, who has been in and out of treatment about 50 times. You heard me right, 50. He is now a passionate advocate for better laws and policies surrounding substance use and harm reduction. I am so excited to hear his story and talk about his journey to becoming a powerful voice for change. Eddie, I am so excited to talk to you about your story because I first heard just a little bit of it when I was testifying on a bill in the South Dakota House and then Senate regarding legalizing fentanyl testing strips. And I heard you testify to legalize fentanyl testing strips because I know you do a lot of advocacy work, but you started telling a little bit about your story during that testimony. And I just thought, I got to talk to this guy.
Yeah, it has been quite a ride. And I'm sure you'll hear today how the disease of addiction lives both in self and in others. And unfortunately for both me and my family, my disease and my behavior in it took us down a very dark road. But today I'm blessed to be able to give back in a space that I know well, right? And I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you, Eddie. Let's just start from the beginning. What kind of kid were you growing up? Where did you grow up? What kinds of things were you into?
Yeah, so I was the oddball kid in the family. I was the loving, oddball, gay kid in the family, right? So I grew up in a family of dentists. They were amazing humans on a little hobby farm in central Maryland on the East Coast. And I hear from other addicts a lot, I did not feel like I fit in. It was almost a family of both who are the men I looked up to and the women that I looked up to. And for some reason, I always cast a shadow over myself. My brother kind of beat up the bullies when I was younger, and my sister was the great student. I was the creative, artistic, and fun one. And it almost seemed like I needed to have fun all the time in order to survive. And that's really what I remember from my childhood. I know that my family system in the early parts of my life was rather good. It seemed like the 1950s lifestyle.
You think that sort of deep-seated insecurity or a feeling of not fitting in is a common thread with people who end up suffering from substance use disorder? Because I could see a little bit of that in my daughter from the time she was a small child, and there was like a little bit of an insecurity. I don't know how to describe it. It was just sort of innate. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I relate to that, Angela, so wholeheartedly, but I want to say sorry for the loss of your daughter, Emily. I will say that is a good way of putting it. There was something different about me, and insecurity may be a good way of putting it, but I always felt like I needed to measure up somehow, right? My attachments in life were completely mishandled. It felt like either I was overly attached and I was people pleasing on the one end, or on the opposite end, I was angry and separate and isolated. I just didn't seem to have those stable relationships with anybody. I felt like there was always something to prove to somebody. And unfortunately, I became that best little boy in the world. And it really stemmed from that internal insecurity that I carried with me. And I think, like Emily, from very, very early on in my life.
Did you have trauma in your childhood or things go horribly wrong?
I had a lot of trauma in my childhood. No secrets in my family. We went through a major divorce. My stepfather entered the picture when I was 10 years old. He was an NFL football player. My grandmother actually played center field for the Rockford Peaches, the League of Their Own story. And my uncle's in the NFL Hall of Fame. So I always felt like I had to measure up somehow, right?
That's a pretty high bar. That's a pretty high bar for any.
Oh.
That's not most human beings are not in the NFL.
They were human to me, but it was how I perceived their light, right? So I perceived their goodness as needing to be something more than I was. For some reason, when my parents divorced, it was nasty. So my sister stayed with my mom. She disowned my dad. And unfortunately, they haven't seen each other in 25 years. She was about 13 years old. My mom disowned my brother. He was about 13, 14 years old. So the family completely split apart. They haven't seen each other in about 25 years. I decided that I wanted to hold on. I wanted to be the kid who didn't let go, and grateful today that I can have them in my family. But when you don't let go, Angela, don't learn to let go. And so the disease of addiction really started its roots in the idea that unfortunately, the little Eddie just didn't know how to take care of himself. I didn't know how to let other people go.
Well, it's a horrible situation for a child to be put into, not just a divorce, but to have a family so divided where people are taking sides and icing out or completely alienating the other parent, or the children and the other children are talking to a certain parent. That's a horrible position to be put in.
It was tough. It was tough. We were in front of the judge a decent amount. I had to testify against family members as a little kid, right? And so I felt like it was my fault. I grew up thinking it was my fault, and more so, I thought that, and I was told so, Angela, many times. So what I know today is it's not my fault what happened, right? That shame part of me holds on to that because that kid would not want to let go. My stepdad shot himself when I was in 11th grade. If you've ever watched that movie by Will Smith, Concussion, he lived, right? However, he most likely has CTE, an encephalopathy that is in the brain that's you can't diagnose until postmortem. But the two highest symptomologies are suicide and addiction. And he suffered from both.
Wow. So at what age did you start experimenting with substances? What was your substance of choice?
Yeah. So if you were doing it, I was doing it. That was kind of how I looked at it, right? So I would say from an early age, my early inkling was to do the normal high school kind of kid routine. I wanted to go to parties and just fit in. So I drank, right? And drinking was okay. It didn't feel like it was anything more, but it was that undertone of I needed to drink because I needed to be with them sort of thing. It wasn't until about the age of 19 that I found my love and my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine, because a lot of the people in the community, the gay community, were using that and having sex. And that became kind of my way of communication with my identity.
I just recently interviewed a man in his 30s who suffered from alcohol addiction. And he didn't start drinking until he was a little older, also gay. And he said when he came out, like his family accepted him. People were okay with him. It was something he couldn't accept within himself. I don't know if you find that to be true within the gay community, that sort of self-stigmatization that obviously comes from a wider cultural issue, but it isn't so much the people close to them are being mean to them or disowning them because of their sexuality. It's more just a general feeling of like, I'm not okay. This isn't okay.
There is no doubt, right? So when I came out to my parents, it was a difficult process. However, on the outside, there was a certain amount of love, right? I didn't feel that initial bump that I would say some of my friends did, but obviously was some reservations. My family still has reservations about being gay internally. It was being framed in society that I had a difficult time with. And to be honestly, Angela, it's an awareness that lives so deep within me that it's hard to find. I knew that I hated myself at times because I was gay. When I was in high school, I would go around to girls and I go, come on, Eddie, you can do it. You can do it. Be attracted to this girl. Be attracted to this girl. And then a guy would walk by and I go, oh, hey. And I go, no, God, please don't.
We tried to conform. That's probably common, right?
I went back in the closet after coming out to teach high school kids. So I was a high school history teacher for many years. Yeah. And I decided to go back in the closet to hide my identity because who I was not good enough.
Eddie's struggle with feeling inadequate and unworthy led him down a dark path. He began experimenting with meth at just 19.
So I was in undergrad. At the time, I left my undergrad because I didn't get into the fraternity that I liked. I felt rejected. So I went to Maryland. And then I went back to the college that I was at originally. I tried first at University of Maryland, and it was with a guy, and I was like, whoa, this is incredible. And I remember that feeling like, geez, this is just knock your socks off sort of thing. And that was really my start into it. And it became a monthly sort of habit. There wasn't a ton of what I would call habitualness yet behind it, but I began teaching high school students while using substances on the weekend.
Wow. It's probably not that unusual. I mean, I have talked to other teachers. I talked to Kentucky's teacher of the year who hid her alcohol addiction. Unbelievable too. She's teacher of the year. Now she's not teaching any longer. But I know it happens, right? It happens. It happens in every profession and every walk of life.
And wouldn't you know, I was a teacher of the year as well.
You were?
Yes,
Oh,
I was Frederick County Friends of Catholic Education's teacher of the year when I was 24 or 25, I think. So the big advantage of having a predisposed shame kid, right, is that when I look at students, I was able to see me in every one of them, right? And so I gave my all to each of those students. When I look back at my teaching career, that was the thing that I was strongest at, classroom management and speaking to little Eddies around the room, right? There were a lot of ancillary things that I wasn't great at, but I was teacher of the year because people were like, man, this guy actually cares about me. And I did. It was just, I didn't care enough about myself.
I am guessing that the use of meth and any other substances escalated at some point then.
It did. So I took a hiatus when I had my first partner. So I was teaching. I moved to a public school at that time. I got my first partner in Washington, D.C. It felt like a fairy tale for me, right? It was one of those things that I had always wanted, but I saw myself becoming jealous. So between you and I and whoever's listening, obviously I was 300 and about 40 pounds at this time. So I had a large weight issue. This person loved me for the size that I was.
During this so-called fairy tale, Eddie managed to quit meth and only occasionally drink. But sadly, that didn't last long. After just a few months, Eddie was struggling again with both his mental health and substance use disorder.
I could not give myself to him. Each time I tried to be honest with him, all I had was jealousy, rage, and internalized hatred for what he was doing. He would cheat on me all the time, and Angela, I would do something like this. Oh, it's not a big deal, but I'm going to go on my phone and try and find out what he's doing. So I could never vocalize my pain.
So it sounds like it was an unhealthy relationship.
Terribly.
If this person's cheating on you and you're feeling bad about yourself and you're overweight, I mean, very unhealthy place to be.
It was a terribly unhealthy relationship. My friends and my family knew it, but we were in love some way, right? There was a love amongst us somehow. We were together for a year and a half. At the end of the relationship, I decided to get lap band surgery. So I wanted to lose the weight. My mom was really encouraging of that.
Now you may think, after undergoing surgery, Eddie would have been motivated to adopt a healthier lifestyle. However, it was actually after his surgery that his drug use took a turn for the worse, and he spiraled out of control.
This was not the only thing that was going on during that time. However, what I will say is that once the relationship ended, things really began to cascade out of control. I ended up being diagnosed HIV positive very quickly afterwards. I thought I was invincible to the world, right? But my addiction really began to slide.
And the HIV, has it been under control?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. So I almost died from the early infection. Rare as it comes, no joke. So my mom and I had a very difficult time getting back together to a place where we understood each other. I was teaching high school at that time, and unfortunately, I got really sick. I didn't know what was happening, but I had this internal feeling that I was HIV sort of sick. As the months went on, I started getting sicker, and my students said, Mr. Krumpotich, you don't look very good. So eventually I went to the hospital, found out that I had HIV. It was way worse than that. I had spine and large intestine issues as a result of the early infection. I was in the hospital for weeks, but my mom came into my life like a bullet out of a train, right? She showed up at the door and became my best advocate after that. It had been many, many years.
While Eddie was extremely thankful to have a renewed relationship with his mother, he still couldn't get a handle on his substance use disorder. It only continued to get worse, even after almost dying from HIV-related infections.
This is addiction, right? This is the insanity of addiction. I used 3 days out of the hospital after almost dying and losing my legs. And that is insane, right? So I started escalating my binge use, not going to work, calling out of work, losing my relationships, moving away. And then I started seeing myself become really sick. And I decided to move to the state of Minnesota to go to my first treatment at Pride Institute. And this was when I was about 26 to 27 years old.
So this was a while ago
Miss
that
Glenn.
you went to your first treatment.
Yes.
And you've been through, I know from doing a little research, many treatments. So let's talk about that.
Holy
You go to your
mackerel.
first treatment. I'm sure you're optimistic, right? Like you're ready for a change. You go to treatment, and how did it go?
Well, great. When you're the best little boy in the world, you know what you can count on? You can count on being everybody's friend. You can count on completing it, and you can count on lying when you're in there and not even knowing it. So I went to treatment wanting to stop using drugs. I went to my first sober house wanting to be sober. I did. It was in there. There was something much, much deeper, this shame response that I had not connected with in the slightest yet. I had a counselor from Pride look me in the face, an outpatient, and she said, Eddie, you have the worst shame I've ever seen. That's what she told me. My ego part of me goes, wow, the worst shame you've ever seen? Wow, what is that like? That's like a compliment, right? I had no idea, Angela, how sick I was. None. About 40 to 50 treatments later, I realized what she was trying to tell me. She was trying to tell me that I was in some severe trouble.
40 to 50. Let's break that down for a second. I don't know if I've ever talked to somebody who's been in 40 to 50 treatments. What kinds of treatments? Who paid for all of this? How did that happen? Tell me a little bit about that, because that's unbelievable. I'm grateful you're still here talking to me.
Yeah.
In some ways, I can't believe it.
Yeah. I should have died a long time ago, right? So from teacher of the year to homeless, on the streets with plastic bags, and I mean for years. So I walked the streets of Minneapolis for off and on, in between treatment spells, for in and out of shelters for about 6 to 7 years, right? And this was, I would be frostbitten, no joke, frostbite on the hands everywhere. Sometimes I went into treatment and I didn't want to be sober during those times. I needed to have a roof over my head. I will say this, that the state of Minnesota paid for those treatments, right? We have a system here that we want people to go into treatment. And so I was able, through public assistance, to get into treatment and talk about a state that saved my life.
But what finally worked? What was it? What was the turning point for you?
There's not one thing, although I'm a believer in a sort of principle, the biopsychosocial models of recovery. This is for anything, Angela, in our lives, whether it's cancer or the way that we habit form to life. Everything has a bio component to it, how we're made and the cards that we're dealt. That psycho component is the way that we think about ourselves, those motors internally that go, I'm enough, I'm these things. That thing waved bye-bye to me a long time ago. So I've worked on that one for a long time. The social part is we are born to connect with others, right? We are born to do it. What I was missing initially was I had that component of social. I didn't interact well, but at least I was there. That psycho component, it was not registering. The key for me was right here. I was born and grew into somebody who had anxiety and ADHD. I was an anxiety and ADHD kid, right? So I was bouncing off the walls. And wouldn't you know, I decided to ask my doctor for pharmacologic help one day. And we together decided to put me on a stimulant in order to treat a stimulant use disorder. So it wasn't until I started taking stimulants in order to get me to homeostasis that some of that thinking could then permeate my new consciousness. I needed to have the very same chemical compound that almost killed me treat me.
Wow. Like an Adderall type thing or a drug like
You
that,
got it.
right?
You got it.
Mhm.
That's where harm
And
reduction
so
came in.
that explains to me maybe why meth was so appealing to you, though. It probably made you feel a lot better if you have ADHD, because stimulants do help people with ADHD.
Angela, I'm just going to give you snaps right now because this is as simple as it gets for addictionology, right? This is as simple as it gets. As a kid, when you have ADHD, you have a depletion, or your reservoir of dopamine is lower than normal. So what do you do in order to counteract that as an ADHD kid? We find fun things to do. So it seems like you're always trying to have fun. That's a sickness. What's happening in the brain is it's trying to pair off behavior and dopamine, but there's just not enough. So what happens is that you need to have a lot of fun in order to get it to normal. I decided when I was 15 years old, I was diagnosed with ADHD by a doctor, and he goes, listen, he was talking to my dad, your son has a terrible case of ADHD. And I told him, sure as anything, I'm not taking anything for it. I love my brain. But you are correct. It was what's wrong. My dopaminergic system was wrong. And eventually, I believe this to be true today because I'm grateful for my addiction. My spirit found methamphetamine because if it wasn't for that, my ADHD was so bad, all it was doing was turning me into shame.
I've just heard you say you're grateful for your addiction. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say that before that I've talked to. And I've interviewed and talked to a lot of people, Eddie. So explain that to me.
I mean, I am more grateful today than I could possibly imagine for meeting the people and finding a spirit within me that is able to give back about something that I care about, right? I don't know many other diseases, and this is true for mental health and addiction. So the only cure, there's one cure for this disease, and it doesn't exist across society to a certain degree, is that I must go in order to come out. Very few people get the opportunity to dive into their own brains, their own consciousness, and their own awareness and see some of the most tormented things, right? So they call addiction many times like the biggest torment of all of the diseases. It has been a blessing to be able to get to know myself that way, because if I wasn't able to go in, I couldn't come out. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to use that knowledge to help other people today. Because if I wasn't doing it, who would?
Yeah. And you have the experience. You basically have the background to do all of that. But you were starting to tell me, though, that the ADHD medications, pharmacological medications are helping you. What else?
Yeah. So it's an AANA, CMA, Smart Recovery. I've done Dharma Recovery. I'm working my steps for the very first time, right? So finding a space of community was hugely important for me. Hugely important. Some community that worked for me. I live in Grand Rapids because it took me away from some triggering mechanisms. I also realized I had to humble myself. So I started my journey of my present day recovery waiting tables. And if you have a rejection issue, just go wait tables for a living, because I would cry my eyes out sitting at the register because it was so hard to go to a table and hear them go, I don't like my steak. And I go, no, I can't believe I screwed up. That's what it was like.
Well, also it occurs to me, though, there is a lot of substance use disorder in the service industry itself. So you're by waiting tables, you're also exposing yourself to others who are most likely, many others, suffering from substance use disorder.
And that's not only true, but in my case, it was empowering, because what it was is I had alcohol right in front of my face each day, but I made the decision each day to be in recovery. And so I was able to participate in activities without fear. So what methamphetamine did is, this is as true as it comes. When you grow up and you invite shame into your life somehow, because that's what happens. It just burrows within us. We only see life, it feels like, through that lens. The real key to addiction is realizing that each of us who are addicted have found a substance that removes it. It removes it. That is how insidious this disease is because normal people have some amounts of shame. They're okay. But ours is so tanked full, those substances just go boom. And it shows us what we think is light for the first time.
Right. It's a trap, though. It's a trick for sure. I mean,
Correct.
yes, people feel better. There's a reason why people use drugs and or alcohol, because it makes people feel better temporarily. Then it's like a big, huge trap, right? And then you're stuck. And that's everybody's story who becomes addicted, right? So I'm so glad that you're doing so well. And then you've taken what you've learned through this whole journey. How long have you been in recovery now?
In truth, the last time I used meth was on Christmas of last year. I had a year and 3 months and decided to go out 5 times between September and December. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster. So currently I'm actually like 50 something days, but that year and 3 months before that was the longest that I had ever had in the state or ever in my life. And so when I found a bottom, it just was able to speak to me that I'd had enough.
Sadly, relapse is part of many people's story. Research shows that between 40 to 60% of people with substance use disorder experience a relapse at some point. It's especially alarming when it comes to alcohol and opioids. Some studies indicate that up to 80% of people who struggle with alcohol addiction may relapse, while that number jumps to 80 to 95% of those who struggle with opioids during the first year after treatment. Unfortunately, relapse can be extremely dangerous. Drug manufacturers are now putting fentanyl in all kinds of illicit drugs, which means even one use could be life-threatening. Plus, when someone is in recovery, their drug tolerance is lower, so if they take the same dose they did before, they're more likely to overdose. Have you lost a loved one to overdose or fentanyl poisoning? I'd like to invite you to share their story on our new Emily's Hope Memorial website called More Than Just a Number. They were our children, siblings, cousins, husbands, wives, aunts, uncles, and friends. So much more than just a number. You can submit a memorial today on morethanjustanumber.org.
So how do you explain relapse?
Relapse is, it's as simple as this. I'm going to use diabetes as an example, right? So diabetes is actually really simple. Diabetes is addiction. That's all diabetes is, right? It's a dopaminergic craving and then an attachment to sugar or a disposition that gives somebody that, right? Relapse is rather simple. Can you expect a diabetic's blood sugar to stay at around 90 to 120 for the rest of their life? It's naturally cyclical. The difference is that the organ that is affected is the pancreas. So the pancreas goes like this, the blood sugar goes up and down and up and down. Let's take addiction. Addiction's disease lives in the brain. So picture that pancreas now as a brain. When your waves go like this, that's like not asking somebody who's eating every day to not have a blood sugar change. The chances of somebody staying sober with that amount of change in the brain is minuscule. So relapse is just decoding those attachments as they come up and they go down. They come up and they go down. Because when the brain is the diseased organ, it is one of the hardest to detach.
And I've heard it takes a couple of years for the brain to recover from substances such as meth. Do you feel any lasting effects from your use? Can you tell, like other times where you're like, oh, this is from the years of doing meth? How many years would you say you did it?
No, I'm close to 20. Close to 20.
Oh, that's a long time.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you ain't lying about that. It is a long, long time. When it comes to things like our dopaminergic receptors, right? We literally burn them out, right? Science says it's about 18 months before we can get what we're going to get back and regrow those receptors. Here's the thing is that now, once you've regrown many of those receptors at around 18 months, many people are still left with their bio. So the brain is going to do the best it can, but you've put on now addiction and then you have your mental health. So what happens in recovery, like you mentioned, is I'll get anhedonic. I will get depressed. I'll get anxious. I'll have sleep trouble. And one of the things that can sometimes be a big issue is dreams. It's a good trigger warning for me, but when my dreams are nightmares, it can be really tough. But that's just how our neurotransmitters are rewiring themselves in our brain. Each little rewire comes with it its own symptom.
And so do you feel, though, like your brain has been healing despite relapse?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't even begin to describe to you the things that I've been able to learn in harm reduction and in substance use disorder treatment. So when that thought of wellness comes up and it's the first thought, and I go, I actually think highly of myself, that is a new pathway. That's neuroplasticity right there, right? When we see, have you ever experienced this, Angela? Maybe you could tell me, just a thought that comes in, you go, wow, that's nice. Can you remember a time that you were like?
Sure. Less time in grief after you lose somebody, but it eventually comes back. Yeah.
That is your brain, no joke, rewiring itself and growing and learning, right? And I want to say this, I lost my brother to a heroin overdose. So I empathize with you as well. But I had to watch my stepmom watch her son die in her arms. And what she did in comparison to what I did, she was like you, right? She was a tank of empathy and a tank getting through that disease. I had so much admiration for a mom who lost her daughter because I was able to watch her. And when I was in my own state of use, I would say, how in the world did she do that? How? And so I just want to give you so much credit because our disease is the one that unfortunately perpetrates on our family. It perpetrates, right? My behaviors are the ones that perpetrate. And they love us unconditionally. They love me unconditionally, right? And that's where that disconnect and that shame was so hard. So I just want to give you so much kudos for your recovery and just say thank you.
Well, Thank you for saying that. You're absolutely right. My daughter's behavior and her changes in her affected every member of our family. And we had so many tough years before this final horrible thing happened. And I'm sure that's the case with your brother as well. It's just so much stress and worry and fear that goes into it for loved ones. And then to have them die, it's just, what was all that for? You know, it's
You know,
hard.
it's hard to, I mean, it's hard to know what it was for. My dad and I had a conversation. This was about 5 or 6 years ago. My dad was just as sick as I was, just as sick. And when I say that, it's because it's a family disease, but he had, since the divorce, I chose my mom. My dad, one of my earliest memories was him leaning on the car like this. And it was one of those things like, I've lost my son, right? I remember it. I was 10 years old. Ever since that day, that man, the chief lover of my life, right, enabled me because he felt guilty. He felt guilty that it was his fault. My addiction didn't allow me to see that amount of beauty. What we had to do was come into a conference one day, and this is no joke, right? I grew up in a rather rich, entitled place. And I looked at my dad. I said, Dad, you've got to let me go. If I call you, you must say no. So it would be 30 below zero outside in St. Paul. I would have no shoes, no socks, and no joke, sometimes no underwear. And I'd be walking, getting frostbite. And I'd call him and I'd say, can you get me a hotel? And my dad had to make the hardest decision that probably any parent has to make. And he had to say no and wait for his son to call back and hopefully he didn't die. And that is what I did to my dad all the time. And when I got sober and I was able to find those places, I realized how those individuals in my life waited for me to heal. And it is a long process, but I mean, you can empathize how hard that no must have been.
Right. I always say sometimes I look back because my daughter did not live because of fentanyl, but I look back and I think I did all these tough love things that I was told to do, right? Like you have to set boundaries and you don't tolerate this behavior. And I regret some of those things now because I think maybe that was the wrong thing to do. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like taking advice and try anything, right? And some of those tough love things, like saying no, were the hardest thing
Man.
to do ever, ever. Of course, my daughter didn't know that at the time. She was just angry. But I don't know if that was the right thing to do or not. I don't know if your dad not getting your hotel room was the right thing to do or not, but you're here and you survived all that, which is amazing to me. It's hard to know, though. It does take its toll as a parent and a loved one, somebody who's suffering from substance use disorder. It really does.
And that toll becomes the reason why many of us continue to use. I was broadly guilty for as long as I can remember. And in that guilt, I didn't find myself even confronting the pain because it hurt so badly. It hurt so badly what I was doing to my family that I would just go out and use to cover it up. The interesting part about addiction and behavior in general is that in order for anything to work, it has to be our idea. We're the one that one day has to say, I've had enough. So what you were doing for your daughter and my dad did for me is he gave us the chance to say, I'm done. Most of the people who get that chance will probably die. And then that is why this disease is so horrible. Because when we get to that choice, that spiritual place where we go, I'm done, we're either this close to death or this close to life. And it's a smidge away. I tried to take my life 2 times and overdosed countless. That smidge I was given the grace by something to have the opportunity just to choose life one time.
Yeah. And you're doing the most that you can with it. So let's talk about that, the harm reduction that you're working on and what you think is most important to happen. I know we talked about fentanyl testing strips and how it is going to be legal to have fentanyl testing strips in South Dakota now. And you helped with that. But what other things do you think are important that we do in this nation to save lives so we can keep people alive until they can make that choice to get well? And you're right. External forces can only do so much. It has to come from within that person.
Yep. Here is where addiction medicine was, and here was the mistake for many years, Angela. Treatments lived here. The addict lived here. Treatments is the resistance, unfortunately. So when you're saying something like just say no to somebody who's in an oppositional disease, right? All you're going to get is what
Right.
happened with you and your daughter and me and my dad. You're going to get anger, resentment, hostility. That's it. So you're not going to penetrate. Here is what harm reduction does. It takes this window and it goes right here. So here's what things like syringe service programs, fentanyl test strips do. When you have an addict who comes into a program like this is what you get. I'm okay with you using. You're worth it. You're lovable, man. When you're ready, we can help you with treatment. So what the addict here is, wait, you're not judging me for this? And so what happens with the eyes and what happens in harm reduction is they begin to see the services that harm reduction provides into things like recovery, because it serves as the beautiful middle ground of empathy. That is what we have been missing. What we need to do is love the addict, not the behavior, right? So when somebody comes and says to you, I'm an addict, instead of going, oh gosh, bless your heart, man, that's tough. Maybe say something like, I'm here if you need me. I don't know how I can help you. Just let me know, right? I'll be here for a ride if you need me. And when they say the word and they say they want help, that window is about that big. So if you have an addict or a friend or somebody in recovery who is slipping and falling and they go, I need help, there is no moment better than that moment right then, because that brain will flip and it will take them off. Empathy is what we've
Right.
been missing.
Right. No, you're right. Empathy has, but also the argument that, well, if you do needle exchanges and other things, some of the things that are being done in California, you're just encouraging drug use. They're never going to stop that way or tolerating it. What do you say to that argument? I mean, the argument.
Yeah, not only is it categorically false, here's the deal. Do you know that if somebody visits a syringe service program for the first time, do you know they're 5 times, this has been studied over and over, 5 times more likely to go to treatment? 5 times. If they go, they are 3 times more likely to lower their drug use. When it comes to uniformed officers, they have less needle stick injuries as a result. And even more so, 50% reduction in STD and infectious diseases like HIV and Hep C.
Right.
I got HIV from a dirty needle. We know that these work. Here's the problem. That stigma that says you're going to create more drug use has everybody from Nebraska to South Dakota to California on the same page. The stats do not support that. It's not even close. And so what we do is we bring empathy to the local communities and we say, hey, this is what we can do for you. I'm working out in Nebraska right now. They're getting ready to pass their very first syringe service program law ever. They had a rise in HIV that was far surpassed their previous 10 years and maybe ever, in truth. They're getting ready to erect syringe service programs because of HIV, just like Mike Pence did in Indiana. So these are things that we know work.
Right. And I think the more we can talk about it, the more we can educate people, the better. And I also believe that medically assisted treatment needs to be much more available. There's some things that have happened in Congress now, but yet there are so many hurdles for doctors to go through to be able to prescribe medicines for people who are suffering from addiction, whether in your case, the ADHD medicine is helpful to you, or if they're being able to prescribe Suboxone or things like that. So that's another big hurdle that we have to get through in this country.
2 words, and I rarely use escalatory language, Angela, but MAT is gold standard. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it right now. None. That means that in order to treat a heart attack with a stent, that's a gold standard treatment, is medicated assisted treatment for opioid use disorder. Period. End of story. There is no doubt in many of the pharmacologic and medical communities that we know that that is the way of it, right? We know that MAT is. The stigma exists in the recovery community, in other communities as well. And so what we're trying to do now is let people know that it's okay to be on a medication for as long as. Here were some of the stats, right? We missed addiction stats a long time ago. People were like, how long have you been sober? Oh, Eddie, you've been sober for 50 days. Did you ask questions like, wow, you have 2 jobs? You go to meetings, you have a recovery. Recovery isn't about the length of time necessarily that you've been sober. It's about what you're doing in your life. So here's what happens with Suboxone and methadone. People are able to go to work, hold apartments, get their kids back, stay safe, not engage in criminal behavior. That right there is recovery, period. And that's what MAT does.
And if we see it as a disease of the brain, just like we see diabetes as a disease or heart problems as a disease, we treat those with medications. We would treat this with medication as well. It only makes sense if you see it that way. But so much of the public, and it's even stigmatized among medical professionals as well, because they don't get the kind of training that they need.
You ain't lying about that. Here's the funny part about addiction. Here's what it used to be. Addiction treatment used to be this. Oh, you have a dopamine problem? Take it away. Take it away. No dopamine for you. We're going to send you to treatment. We're not going to put anything there because if you have dopamine, then nah. Here's what MAT did beautifully. Opioid use disorder may have saved addiction. And here is why. Because it was the first disorder in addiction where they went, what if they need opioids? Wait, what if we're missing the boat here? What if it's not, they don't? What if it's that they do? And so what methadone and Suboxone did is it gave them just enough. And what that does is that now they use their drug of choice to pair behavior. And so they're in treatment, they're going to work, and they're using the drug that they need in order to survive. That is new addiction medicine.
Right. That's a great way to put it. I haven't heard it put exactly like that. What do you think we need to do next in this country? What do you want to see?
Yeah. So, I think the new track here for addiction medicine, right, is to meet people where they're at, whatever that looks like. So some communities have decided they're going to do overdose prevention sites where people can go and appropriately use inside these. So the idea here is that we know that drug use happens. It's not going to stop. Period. End of story. It's like asking to get rid of obesity. You're using drugs. Okay, that's okay. We're going to treat you here. And when you're ready, we're going to go all in. And so that means increasing subsidies for treatment programs. It puts grant funding for states. Those states that don't like to put out state-funded treatment centers, it's important to have enough where people can get in at a time that's not 28 days later. We need right now. So when people ask for help, they're moving in.
Or just 28 days long, as dictated by the insurance companies, right?
You ain't lying about that.
Yeah, I do think that we have to change. In some ways, fentanyl is doing this, right? What fentanyl is doing to this country and the number of lives it's taking and being the number one killer of people 18 to 45 and all of the people like me who have been affected by loss due to fentanyl is forcing people and forcing our society. At some point, there's a tipping point, right? On how we view and treat addiction, because it's always been someone else's problem. It's always been hidden and over here in the shadows. Even if it wasn't your own family, you hid it. But now I think that it has to change because just of the sheer number of deaths happening.
Yep. South Dakota increased their overdoses last year exponential. This can be preventable, right? What fentanyl test strips and your advocacy does is it tells the addict, like myself, who's walked into detoxes, who had fentanyl and ecstasy in my drugs when I didn't use them. I tested positive for both of them. It allows us to know what we're using long enough to hear the message of recovery. That is what your advocacy does. It just says to the addict, you're good enough. We're going to keep you alive and we're going to keep our community safe. Because imagine this for a police officer. Imagine if you have somebody testing their stuff and it's laced with fentanyl. And then all of a sudden the police get a tip and they're like, look, the stuff coming in here is from fentanyl. This now becomes a public health issue and a policing issue where we can agree. Drug users want to know what they're using. Police want to know what drug users are using. We can come together and create a system that allows us to talk to each other and eradicate this disease.
Right. And that's what we are working toward. It seems like a pretty heavy lift here, Eddie, but I'm glad that we're on the same side.
Yes, we are.
Because it's going to take a lot of people to really change hearts and minds and policies and all of these things in our country. And it just seems to me like baby step at a time. In the meantime, what's terrifying to me is people continue to die. I'm glad you weren't one of them. I'm glad you are here to do this work.
I am fortunate and grateful because I should have been dead. I don't know why my higher power decided to choose me over some of my friends and family. But the reason I do the work that I do is because I've been given the grace to wake up tomorrow and to wake up today. I held guilt over my head for a long time for things like my brother's death. But what I do know is that what you're doing and what I'm doing puts in my heart exactly what needs to be there, which is service to others. That is my MO for getting sober. And so I just appreciate you for the work that you're doing as well.
Well, thank you. Service to others is my, I don't know if antidote is the right word, but it's my answer to grief. So it can be your answer to addiction and guilt. It can be your answer to grief. I think service to others is so important. So thanks for what you do too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grieving Out Loud. If you want to check out more episodes or learn how to get involved in our mission, head over to our website, emily'shope.charity. If you found this podcast helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a positive review and shared it with your friends and family. Together, we can raise awareness about our country's drug crisis and hopefully prevent future tragedies. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, wishing you faith, hope, and courage. This podcast is produced by Casey Wonnenberg King and Anna Fye.